Good afternoon. So for this lecture, I'm going to talk about the progressive era and focus mainly on matters related to gender and sexuality. Some of this material is referred to in the chapter, but some of it is just an addition, just some more information that Foner didn't cover, but that I thought was really relevant and interesting for our class to explore. All right, so I'm going to go back to the very first slide here. So this image is of Isadora Duncan, who was a dancer that Foner does talk about. She was known as one of the first so-called modern dancers because in some ways she challenged a lot of the conventions of earlier methods of dance. She was not kind of classically trained. Instead, her movements were kind of looser, more fluid. As you can see, her clothing was often very loose. And in this way, she expressed the desire among many to kind of liberate not only their minds but their bodies and to explore fuller ideas of women, of womanhood, even of manhood, and also of sexuality. So I use her as kind of a symbol for to understand some of the new developments of this era. Some of the general themes of the progressive era are these, advocating for worker rights and women's rights. Progressive era is also known for efforts to reduce political corruption, the rise of a consumer society of advertising, of other kind of marketing, and of the growth of these new immigrant communities, particularly in cities like New York, where the majority of the population in the early 20th century are made up of these new immigrants, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe. A lot of those themes come together in the tragedy that the textbook talks about at the beginning, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911. The many women who died during that fire were new immigrants, and they worked 14-hour shifts. And one of the reasons that they died is that the owner of the factory had locked the doors, so that they could not leave. Once the fire broke out, they couldn't get out of the building, and so that's why many of them, in a desperate attempt to escape, just jumped out the windows and fell onto the street. So this image that you see are the police officers looking up at the windows and the bodies of these women that fell onto the street. And as the textbook notes, this tragedy, because it was so shocking, the number of women who died, the scope of the tragedy, ultimately propelled some reform, some labor reform. But there were efforts even before that, and while the factory that was involved in that fire was not part of these, was not one of those that cooperated or agreed to these new efforts at labor reform, there was a huge garment worker strike in New York City in 1909. There were also garment worker strikes in other cities as well. And they were actually overall tremendously successful. They managed to unionize a lot of women. They managed to get shorter working hours and more protections. And so in many ways, this was actually a very successful labor movement of the time. And the textbook does talk about this in some more detail. Part of the reason for this success also were the efforts of more kind of upper class women who helped promote these reform efforts of their kind of working class sisters. And it became, for kind of upper class women reformers, their efforts are sometimes called kind of maternalist reform. So they were extending, using their privilege in some ways, to advocate for working class immigrant communities. And they did focus particular effort at protections for women workers and for children workers. And some of this, it's a little bit contradictory because they had to in some ways say, well, we're going to advocate for better working conditions for women because really we would like them to be healthy and bear more children. And they also kind of, some of their arguments were connected to this idea that women were not quite as strong and were more fragile and in need of protection than men. But eventually, these reforms did actually have a significant and positive impact on men in the labor force as well. And they resulted in, new minimum wage laws, workman's comp, protections against unemployment, as well as you can see this image. It's about the inspection of meat. So a lot of the kind of regulations of the food industry and consumer protections came out of this era as well. Another social movement that the textbook discusses is the settlement houses, another kind of social reform. So this is an image of Jane Addams, who became very well known for establishing Hull House in Chicago. It was a place that served the needs of immigrant communities in Chicago and established, a kindergarten. They had other kinds of classes for the women that lived there. And so this was, and Jane Addams became very, very influential in kind of the social work movement. Ultimately, she said, though, that these kinds of charitable efforts were not enough, so she and others really pushed for more government policy reform. And there were other women that echoed this. So Julia Lathrop was the first. He helped establish the Children's Bureau and was the first federal woman in a federal position. Florence Kelly helped establish the National Consumers League. And here's where you see this effective alliance between kind of middle class or upper class women and working class women, because what she said was, look, this place like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, they became so powerful because they produced these immensely popular new shirts that lots of women are consuming. Well, she said, if you're going to be, a conscientious consumer means being willing to not buy from factories that exploit other women who are working to produce those things that you enjoy. So the idea of the boycott, of using your position as consumer to advocate for reform, a lot of that started with the National Consumers League and Florence Kelly's work. And all of these women kind of represented this generation that sometimes people call the new women. They were women who had access to college education. Often they did not get married so that they could kind of focus their efforts on reform. It was, some of them did get married, but marriage in many ways limited women's ability to be effective kind of advocates and reformers. And so many of them kind of chose to remain unmarried for that reason. They also talk about voting rights, the women's suffrage movement, and how at this point, now this wasn't the first time women were advocating for greater rights, but at this point it becomes this kind of mass movement, and you see a lot of labor reformers and political reformers kind of joining in. And a lot of these things happen most quickly in the West, where women had in some ways more autonomy in Western states. And part of this is because they were often kind of left alone on these homesteads, and they had to manage the household affairs, and they had to sign legal documents. And so for some kind of practical reasons, women already were in some ways given more kind of economic power in the West, and also Western states in some ways wanted to attract more families, and so this also was kind of an effort to draw more families to Western states. So suffragists used new strategies as well. They used advertising. They used, these popular entertainers, including these popular kind of women celebrities, became these spokespeople for the suffrage movement. And you'll see here, this is one advertisement that they used to say that women are they contribute to our society, they pay taxes, and they're law abiding, right? And so part of this was this idea that if you let women vote, they will help promote other progressive reforms. This phrase, women clean the homes, let them help clean the city. It's not a political phrase that would be used today, but at the time it was this idea that that women could kind of extend their role as keepers of the home to a kind of public housekeeping role. That became an effective political strategy eventually for women suffragists. It was a long and difficult road, but eventually, at least for white women, they achieved the right to vote in 1920. So there were other kinds of women's rights movements as well, and some of them were more kind of cultural. So the text talks about this club called Heterodoxy that formed in Greenwich Village, and it was made up of these women professionals and academics, and they advocated for suffrage and economic independence, but they also were talking about other kind of personal efforts, encouraging women sometimes to delay marriage or to limit childbirth because it gave them, the argument was, it gave them more autonomy. And they challenged some of the views of what was good for women's health and sexuality. You see a woman over here; she's doing this really scandalous thing of smoking. That was something that was not considered womanly. Now, of course, much later we know that smoking is not good for health, but in this time, women smoking in particular became a kind of symbol of defiance and of independence. Um, and another thing that really becomes a symbol of independence is the bicycle. And bicycles had become really popular in the end of the 19th century. They continue to be popular in this era. And Susan B. Anthony very famously says that she thought the bicycle did more to emancipate women than anything in the world. And that idea of freedom and independence of travel. The other thing is that to ride a bicycle, usually you couldn't wear the old kind of Victorian gear. You had to wear shorter skirts, and sometimes they advocated wearing bloomers, these kind of loose pants that some women reformers were advocating. It was part of this broader effort at kind of what they called rational dress reform, saying that women should be able to wear clothes that are more comfortable. They shouldn't have to wear corsets. They should have shorter skirts so that their feet are freer to move, and to wear bloomers so that their legs don't get caught up, in the spokes of the bicycle. So this kind of freedom of dress was really seen as part of liberating women in general. And so, bicycle clubs grow up and they become really, really popular among women reformers. And I should also note that this term feminism comes into play at this point, and it's this represents this new kind of exploration of freedom for women. I also wanted to note that this is a time when kind of physical culture is also being um, part of popular entertainment and lifestyle. So in 1901, you had the first bodybuilding show, and the Eugene Sandow was called the strongest man in the world. He became really kind of the first bodybuilder, and you can see images of him here, including one on a bicycle. And the idea that this drew from were some concerns about, a lot of these new forms of work, particularly in urban areas, was very it was more sedentary. You were working in offices, you were sitting at desks. And so certainly for the upper and middle classes in particular, there were some concerns among men that, what would kind of this might be a hindrance to their manhood. So a way of preserving the kind of strong physicality of manhood. This was a way to do this through these honestly, these more kind of leisure pursuits. And Sandow was promoted by another man named Bernard McFadden, who became probably the most well-known advocate of this new physical culture. And you can see an image of him on the left here. He was known for taking really, really long walks, often barefoot. He had he promoted what he considered a kind of healthy lifestyle and good eating. So he said, like, the great evils to society are white bread and too much red meat. So he kind of advocated more for the eating of more vegetables. In many ways, not that different from what is considered healthy today. He went to some great extremes, actually. He was against vaccinations. He also kind of believed that baldness could be cured by tugging at one's scalp. So he had some pretty kind of erratic ideas, especially later in his life. But for his own self, he had a kind of remarkable story of recovery. But as a young child, he was very sick. His mother had died of tuberculosis. His father had died because he was an alcoholic. So McFadden becomes kind of orphaned by the time he's 11 years old, and he has to kind of, in some ways, kind of lease himself out to work as what they called a bound boy on a farm. But it's working on the farm that he finds particularly rejuvenating, and he starts to love doing outdoor work. And so after his time there ends, he becomes essentially a kind of physical therapist, for some folks, and a health advocate. And he founds this magazine called Physical Culture that becomes incredibly popular. So he starts his whole publishing empire where he's promoting his ideas. He also later marries, he marries several times, but his last wife was Mary Williamson, who herself was known as a swimmer. And for him, she was the ideal partner in this endeavor. And so you can see an image of her on the right. And they had many children. They had 7 children ultimately, and they would go on tours, and you could see some of their kids in the middle here, doing these sort of physical feats, standing on their head, showing the virtues of an athletic, physically fit lifestyle. And he became kind of one of the first people to be like, there are many people that would obviously follow them, but they became like the kind of physical culture family. And so keep in mind that this is a time when there is in many ways this kind of more open endorsements of physicality itself. And you notice that for Mary Williamson in particular, this is what would be considered a pretty revealing photograph of her. That there were many ways that this was promoted a kind of liberating image of the body. And sometimes McFadden would get in trouble with more repressive legislation, which I'll talk about in a second, but for violating obscenity laws, for things that he would publish in his magazine. The other thing that happens in this period is a number of women reformers, mainly upper and middle class white women reformers. They had a number of them had what they called at the time romantic friendships, and these were really intimate relationships. The term that came to be used most frequently was the Boston marriage. And you can see here a list of a number of prominent women reformers: Anne Howard Shaw, Lucy Anthony, Jane Addams, Mary Rosette Smith, Sophonisba Breckinridge, and Marion Talbot, and Edith Abbott. So all of these women formed these long-term intimate relationships and partnerships in their lives. Now, they never publicly called these romantic relationships. It was very dangerous to do so. But now, now that historians look at their letters to each other, it's very clear that these are romantic relationships that were tolerated mainly because a lot of these women already had some kind of privilege and prominence, so it and wealth, and that kind of gave them a certain kind of freedom that other more working class women didn't necessarily have. But it certainly became one of those kind of times and spaces where women could have intimate relationships with each other. Another, however, there are, this is at a time when this is kind of the other side of the progressive era reforms. There's the government is acting more aggressively in lots of realms, and that includes in this area as well. So there were new immigration restrictions based on what they considered kind of moral degeneracy, but really this was a way of barring folks who were suspected of having an interest in people of the same sex and the LGBTQ community in general. Um, in 1920, Congress made sodomy illegal more formally. Now, there were sodomy laws that existed well before this, but this gets kind of reinforced at the federal level. It's also reinforced in a number of states. They ban. They also expand the definition of sodomy to include anal and oral sex, actually between men and women as well as between two men. And in 1921, they essentially bar LGBTQ folks from the army. And they also were targeting bars and other establishments in cities that were actually catering to the LGBTQ community. And they would do this by, to get a liquor license, you had to demonstrate what they called good character. And so these were other tools that they would frequently raid bars. This goes well into the 20th century. But this is where they more aggressively target these establishments as well. And this is because there is, particularly in urban areas, a kind of a rise of a sort of LGBTQ culture, and that's because cities in many ways offer more protections. You have the kind of freedom to be more anonymous in cities. And so for folks who were attracted to people of their same gender or sexual orientation, cities were popular. It was a way of kind of being free to be who you are. And so, and more establishments were kind of very quietly and covertly protecting these communities. So you had new meeting places, and they had these disguises, artistic societies or athletic clubs, but really were safe spaces for the LGBTQ communities. And so other areas like boarding houses and bohemian communities like Greenwich Village. Now, by the 1920s, the term homosexual, now today that's really a derogatory term, but at the time it was not. It was a more kind of positive term, or at least a neutral term to describe a kind of emerging identity. And in 1924, Henry Gerber establishes really the first kind of organization to advocate for the LGBTQ community called the Society for Human Rights, and he founds this in Chicago. And it only lasts a year because Gerber and the other leaders were arrested, they were imprisoned. Gerber spent several months imprisoned, charged with sex crimes, and so they had to abandon their efforts. But they do manage to they do provide an important precedent that later organizations would follow. I also want you to note here that in this is the application that Gerber filed for this society. And you could see in this little paragraph when he talks about it, he talks about promoting the interests of people who, by reasons of mental and physical abnormalities, are abused and hindered in the legal pursuit of happiness, which is guaranteed them by the Declaration of Independence. So in some ways, he is defining this group as people who have quote unquote abnormalities that I think today we would consider kind of deeply, problematic. But at the time, it was a way he was kind of, I would say, kind of accommodating to the prejudices of his time. But he's using it as a way to kind of say this is a community that's being persecuted for qualities that they have no control over. And I love the way that he uses the Declaration of Independence, that hindering from the legal pursuit of happiness, asserting that right in this application. And as he says, combat the public prejudices against them. And in some ways, so this is a challenge. This is saying that it's saying we are law abiding. We're working in harmony with all the existing laws. We're not trying to directly challenge any laws that exist, but we also, this is kind of who we are, and we shouldn't be sort of persecuted. So in that way, it's a strong defense of LGBTQ folks. And then the last area I want to talk about is birth control activism. So another area that, and this is talked about in the textbook to some extent, Margaret Sanger's work, her formation of the American Birth Control League. One of the things I wanted to highlight is that she makes this helps to make this considered a medical issue. And at the time, most male doctors are not supporters of contraception, but Sanger and other birth control advocates are saying, no, this is a health concern. Women who can't have any kind of control over their fertility, that it's very dangerous. And certainly if women who had many children, that they were, having a child at that time was dangerous. Lots of women died in childbirth, and certainly if they had many pregnancies in a row, this was a very kind of difficult thing for the body to do over and over again, in one after the other. So and this was also, what Sanger and others would say was a way of alleviating poverty, right? Because if you could limit the number of people in the family, you could take better care of the children that you had. And so she saw this as a kind of anti-poverty measure as well. Eventually, Sanger does get jailed numerous times. Eventually, it's why she flees the country. But there were other advocates, Emma Goldman, Helen Keller, who of course is known for being blind and deaf, but really she was a pretty big advocate of a lot of things that were considered pretty radical at the time. Labor rights, union. She was a member of the IWW, and she was a socialist, so she was pretty radical in a lot of ways. And she also advocated birth control. I also wanted to note that there were the existing contraception methods. Those did exist. They weren't quite reliable, but they did exist, and you can see some images here of an early example of a sponge, and of a cap, and of a kind of a device that would, after you had sex, you could use this other device on the left to kind of wash out the semen. So these kinds of devices exist. Condoms actually exist since for many decades before this. Actually, before the 19th century, condoms exist, and at this point they're mainly made of rubber. Later they're made of latex, but this is early condoms, or 19th century condoms, were made out of rubber. But they weren't authorized by the medical establishment. And so It was non-medical sources that sold this. And the Comstock laws, those were the laws that essentially said it's illegal to send any information or any of these kinds of materials on birth control through the mail. And these were the Comstock laws in general were laws that were supposedly against kind of obscenity. So this was kind of the umbrella under which they put birth control, that it was obscene to talk about birth control or to advocate for birth control at the time. So this was, but this was what a number of women engaged in. Some other progressive era reformers kind of kept their distance because it was they considered it too radical and not, popular. But these were kind of the early um, advocates of birth control in the United States. So that's it for this chapter, and I will see you next time.